and
So,
powerful.
so a couple of the students that were working at a research lab at UCLA that I'd become acquainted with, they offered to help me set up how to do a study, because I didn't have a clue.
Mm-hmm.
So the first study, they gave me the guidelines, and I made these earthing mats. Ground planes is what they would be technically called, and where I took some conductive fabric and bonded them to some wool fabric and then connected a wire to them, put them in the earth, and then would have people sleep on them for the study. But in order to do the study properly, we had to get like 60 subjects, 30 of them grounded, 30 of them not grounded. And I had to have somebody to keep it blind, to manage it, so I ended up finding a nurse that would help with that. And this is really the most interesting thing when I look back now. But at the time, the docs wouldn't loan me any other patients. Mm-hmm. And I didn't understand then, but I do understand now why they couldn't. And so anyhow, I went to get a haircut one day, and I was in a beauty salon and heard a couple of the ladies talking about pain and whatever and sleep. And I thought, well, this is great. So I ended up passing out, inquiries for people wanting to be participants in the study at about 10 beauty salons in Ventura, California. And we ended up with 60-some subjects. And so this nurse showed up that helped with the studies, and so she set everything up and figured out which ones were going to be grounded and which ones are, the A group and the B group mm-hmm. by name. And then I was the only person that knew which ones were grounded, so I went out and actually grounded, had the people sleep on these mats.
And either everyone slept at the same mats, either they were grounded or they weren't.
Yes.
So the control for that variable.
Yeah. And it was really painful for me to use the control, but
mm-hmm. That's the way science works.
That's the way it works.
You have to be, yeah.
But anyhow, so at the end result of that study, this is still an anecdotal study, mm-hmm. but that's where you start. Mm-hmm. And so, the majority of the people reported improved sleep, less pain, feeling better, and a couple of people reported significant changes in PMS cramps, blood pressure, asthma, all kinds of anecdotal things off the side. But we were really looking at, do you sleep better, do you have less pain? Because that's what had showed up for me. And so we, when that study was done, then we went on to, I ran into Dr. Ghali, who was a retired anesthesiologist who was kind of involved in the energy medicine, EMF world, and wanting to do some research. And so we had met through Larry Gust, somebody you may know. And so he said, first of all, he didn't believe it either. Nobody believes. Stick my foot on the earth, it's going to make me feel better. But anyhow, he decided to do a study of 12 people over 30 days where we measured saliva, cortisol, DHEA, and so on. And so we would take the saliva every 4 hours for 24 hours to create a profile, and then we would go ground them. And then these were their own controls. Then we would go ground them for, I think it was 6 to 8 weeks on that one. And then we, at the end of 6 weeks, did another cortisol profile. And that's where we saw that before the older ladies had, exhausted adrenals, they would have low cortisol in the morning. And the younger ladies who were kind of high stressed would have high cortisol. But at the end of the study, they all synchronized into a nice little circadian rhythm pattern. And it was profound. And but the reason we used cortisol, because if EMFs were affecting you, they would be stressing, supposedly. And cortisol is your stress hormone. So that's how that study came along. And then after meeting Dr. Ghali, I met Dr. Chevalier at the California Institute of Human Sciences. And he was working with energy medicine and so on. And so that's when we started doing some biofeedback studies. Am I on course here? I mean,
yeah, no,
okay.
It's perfect.
Okay. I started the biofeedback studies, and that's where we started measuring brain waves, muscle tension, just about everything that you can measure. And so then, I don't remember the exact chronology, there's so much of it, but that's when the athletes kind of got heavily involved. And so
Somehow someone heard about the pain potential,
Yeah.
more than likely, and he tried one athlete and then it started
Yeah.
snow.
Yeah, you
snowballing,
kind of, that whole world kind
rolling.
of exploded. So we did, but it's really hard to do controlled studies with the athletes, so
Yeah.
we kind of,
Too many variables.
yeah, too many variables. And so we backed off of that, but that kind of.
But anecdotally, I mean, you got Lance's discovery team, and him and the
Yeah, we
Tour de
had.
France would be probably the most extreme example, but there's, I'm
Yeah,
sure there's
he's-
a lot of other
yeah,
similar
Lance-
professional athletes.
Yeah, I would say we probably have 200 or 300 of some of the most elite athletes in the world using grounding over the last 5 years.
It's a pretty, I didn't realize it until you just said that right now. So that's a very
Yeah.
powerful anecdotal testimony, because an elite professional athlete can pretty much have access to anything, and they wouldn't continue something,
Yeah.
and this is really inexpensive anyway, but they wouldn't continue something if it wasn't providing them benefit.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of word of mouth.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain group of them that kind of started, and then, I don't necessarily want to throw out names, but there's, it kind of goes amongst themselves what they do, but it's everybody in the athletic world is secretive.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's going to give up their strategy on,
Right.
or any of their.
It's a competitive advantage.
Very competitive, yeah.
Yeah.
And but anyhow, it's just kind of slowly. It's recovery. It's primarily during training and.
Yeah, for anyone who's participated, I mean, most people watching this were exercise, but not as many people participate in competitive athletics. And when
Right.
you do that, the recovery is so crucial, because if you have the
Yeah.
recovery wrong, you're going to be ruined. You just
Right.
won't ever get to the peak level you need to.
Right. Yeah, and that's interesting. That's how we ended up doing the DOM study, delayed onset muscle soreness study,
Mhm.
that we did at the University of Oregon with Dick Brown. And it was because of all the athletes, because they wanted to understand, well, what's really going on here? Because, recovery, delayed onset muscle soreness, most people will experience it in the spring when they go out and work in the yard for 2 or 3 days, and about 3 days later they can't walk, they can't move. It's induced inflammation.
Mhm.
Well, this is what athletes go through chronically in their workouts and training. And so what we did is we took, in that study, we took 20-year-old guys, perfect health, and the only way we knew we were affecting inflammation in the body, but we could never test it.
Mhm.
And that was one of the problems I was running into at the universities. They let me test anything in the world, but I couldn't test inflammation. And so anyhow, the only way we could do it is to have them do these exercises where they would stand on their toes with a third of their weight on their body and do 10 sets of toe crunches for, I think, 20 seconds each. And so what it did is it burned the calves of the leg. And so technically 3 days later they shouldn't be able to walk very well anyway. So anyhow, then what they did is we used the same room for each subject. This was a study that went over many, many months. And we used the same room. And we had the same diet every day for every person in the whole system. And so the first thing we did is they drew blood and took MRIs.
Mhm.
And then they did the exercises. Then that night they drew blood again. And then every morning they drew blood, every afternoon or every evening they drew blood throughout the duration of the study, so we could monitor the effects of the biomarkers. And it's an astounding picture. This study was published, I think, a year or so ago. And but the two things that really showed up, three things that I can easily explain, but the white blood cells, we had no elevation in white blood cells in the grounded subjects. In the ungrounded subjects, extremely elevated. Well, that's inflammation to me. Okay. Second of all, and the most profound thing that needs additional follow-up study, is we had a 40% drop in bilirubin in the ungrounded subjects. In the grounded subjects, maybe a 5% drop. Well, bilirubin is one of the body's primary antioxidant reserves. And it's like people who have MS, where the immune system is eating up the myelin sheath. Increasing their bilirubin helps to inhibit MS. So it's a primary thing. So those two things say that we used up the bilirubin and we had elevated white blood cells. So, and then the grounded subjects, we had neither. And then most important, pain is subjective, so we had two types of pain. One schedules, one where they would answer anecdotally on a scale of 1 to 10 each day. And then Dick Brown, he's really a great researcher, but he took a blood pressure cuff and would put it on around the calf where the inflammation was. And they would pump it up and see how much pressure the person could take. Well, the grounded subjects could take more pressure each day, even afterwards. The ungrounded subjects could take less pressure. So it was a very objective way of measuring pain. So the purpose of that study was to, what's going on? Why is recovery improving? It's because we don't have less inflammation. And even though that was a pilot study, it was still suggested that this is the first modality that prevents or reduces inflammation from DOMS. There's no, I mean, ice packs, you know, things of that nature, aspirin, Advil. So that was a great study. But that was related, we got off on the athletes there.
Sure, sure.
But that's why that study was done. And I'm really glad we did it, because that was the first time that we clearly understood that inflammation was, that when a person is grounded, just like the cows, they don't get inflammation. You don't have the chronic inflammation.
Yeah, and I'm wondering how your experiences growing up as a cowboy in Montana early on, and your experiences with the Indians, did that somehow reaffirm your connection to nature and kind of connect the dots that there may be an issue here? Because I remember you mentioning earlier what your observations were seeing the cows when they became sick or injured, that they would actually go and lay down on the ground.
Yeah, I'll tell you one short story. I think it's in the book, but I remember one time riding with my dad, and we came across this calf that either had gotten tangled up in some barbed wire, or, you know, some animal might have been chewing at her. But anyhow, you know, a big chunk of her intestines were hanging out. And the mother was standing there kind of protecting the calf. But anyhow, we were a mile and a half from the barn, and we had nothing with us except my dad had some needle and thread, which, I mean, he's experienced with. So anyhow, rolled the calf over, pushed the intestines back inside, and sewed it up. And he said, "There's nothing more we can do." And so we left the calf, and the calf seemed okay. I mean, you're not running around or anything. But about a week later, here's this calf out running with the other calves. And that always puzzled me, because when a human gets sick, you have to call the ambulance, get him to the hospital, and then you got to have all this totally sterile environment. And here's this calf. I mean, there's no sterile, nothing was sterile. I mean, and yet this calf healed up, and that always puzzled me. I never really understood it. I figured,
Did it go to calf intensive care unit?
No,
Yeah.
but so I figured humans and animals are different, you know.
Yeah.
But as time went on, I learned that we're more the same than different. And